Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Friday afternoon, May 10th. Happy to be joined once again by Ryan Phillips of the Assembly Call, and also now a new title. He was with the Big Lead for a long time, now a senior writer for Sports Illustrated. Ryan, how does it feel to be announced on Podcast on the Brink as a senior writer at Sports Illustrated?
I got to admit, it doesn't suck, Alex. It doesn't suck. Big change for those who haven't been following along. I've moved over there with some of my old team members from the Big Lead, and we're really excited. I mean, I've said this a couple times now, but growing up, my dream was to play third base for the San Diego Padres. And on the slight chance that that didn't come true, I gave myself a backup plan, and that was to write for Sports Illustrated. And for it to happen, it took a long time, but it happened. Is pretty humbling and amazing. And honestly, a lot of Indiana fans have supported me over the years and read my stuff, and that's helped me get here. So to anybody listening who's read anything I've written before, or even just clicked on a single article, I appreciate it. It helped me get where I am.
So I'm obviously a bit of a sports media nerd growing up, the son of a sports writer. I can remember growing up getting Sports Illustrated in the mail. I can remember getting the Sporting News, reading Mike DeCourcy, reading other just it used to be nice to have the printed product in hand. Obviously, those times are kind of gone, but I'm just curious, like kind of starting off on a non-IU topic here from your career in terms of where you started in terms of writing on the internet to now getting to where you are writing at SI.com. What's the whole journey been like? Just starting out, I don't think you probably anticipated that you would get to this point, and obviously, there's been a lot of changes over a long period of time with how blogs were. Back when we started writing Inside the Hall, it was called a blog. I don't really call it that anymore. And, Ryan and Eamon wrote posts over at AOL Fan House and had their blog. And it's just changed so much over time. I'm just kind of curious. Obviously, we could probably dedicate a whole episode to just talking about this. But sure. I'm just kind of curious, like from your perspective, the evolution of writing on the internet and how the journey is kind of taking you to work from where you started to where you are now.
It's been incredible, man. I was in the last class at Indiana that was not taught on internet writing. I did magazine and newspaper writing, and I remember I graduated, and within a year or two, they had like an online writing class, like how to write for the internet, and it is a completely different skill. And right out of college, I worked for the Republic in Columbus, Indiana. I lived in Bloomington, drove 35 minutes to work, drove all over the state, covering high school games, had some real like, is this what I want to do with my life moments, where when I'm overnight, and nothing against this town, it just comes to mind, but Lawrenceburg, Indiana for a girls basketball sectional. And I'm just like, I'm not home. I'm in this tiny motel. Like, is this what I want to do with my life? And so I had a couple of those moments. And then, I started Rumors and Rants, my old website, and that kind of paralleled a bunch of those, Fan House, the Big Lead. Some of those were obviously much bigger than mine, but it was sort of around the same time. And I always kept that going. And I really loved writing on the internet because I think it was more opinion driven, more personality driven, and more, I would say, sort of like you're a character, as opposed to writing for a newspaper, which is very like you're inside a box. And that has changed over time to where now writing on the internet is as respected as writing in a newspaper or writing a column or doing any of those things. And it really has sort of caught up and evened up. And writing for the Big Lead, I've been at the Big Lead, and I mean, it's shocking to say this, but I've been there for 8 years until now. And just seeing how respected that publication became in the sports media world. Certainly, I know it's not the biggest site in the world, but in the sports media world, because the quality of the writing was equal to other places. And, see, like Inside the Hall, I mean, like seeing the evolution of what you guys have done from, I remember the day it started, because I went to school with Eamon and Ryan, and so I was following everything they did at their old blog and then to AOL and all that. And I remember watching it launch, and I was just kind of like, this is great. But, at the time it was a blog, and I don't consider it a blog anymore. It's a website. And right. I think that you've seen the Big Lead and places like that develop from like, okay, we're sports blogging. It's really like, like loose and just kind of firing bullets in the air to like, no, this is actually a professional publication. So it's been crazy to see the development of internet writing over the last 15 years and what it's become, and how a lot of people, those are their go-to places for news now. And it's sad because I think there's a huge newspapers serve a huge need, and online, and other television and all those serve a huge need, but you're starting to see those other sources become as respected as the old print and magazine used to be. So it's been a weird journey, and it's the kind of thing where while you're going along on it, you don't stop to see that, and then at some point you just pop your head up and kind of give the 10,000 foot view, and you're like, oh wow, things have changed a lot, and it happens.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've noticed recently, I like to take a walk sometimes in the morning around the block, and growing up, I remember everyone would get the newspaper and it'd either be in that box outside or it'd be in the yard. And now I walk around the block and I'll probably walk past 20, 30 houses, and I think there's two that have the newspaper outside in the yard, like in the morning or on the driveway. So that kind of tells you it's and this is a pretty big city.
They all have
where
it on
I live
their phone now too,
Right. So it's just growing up in a different time where you like to have that printed thing, every morning and look at it. It's become different. Same thing kind of with Sports Illustrated. Everything's moved online, and I don't know what the exact status of the magazine's been the last couple of years. I don't subscribe anymore. I used to, but I don't necessarily think
change that. I'm going to help change that.
it's not coming out as frequently. So it's just everything's moved online, and I agree with a lot of what you said. But I want to dive into IU basketball. Obviously, had you on a couple times during the season, and I always just kind of like to get your thoughts because, you don't sugarcoat anything. You give us your raw feelings on everything IU basketball, whether sometimes that's good or bad, and that can be up for debate. But, big picture right now, just kind of how are you feeling about where Indiana's offseason is right now in terms of what they've done in terms of the roster overhaul, what Mike Woodson's been able to do? I don't, if you want to assign a letter grade, feel free to do that. But I'm just kind of curious your big picture thoughts on where Indiana stands right now.
Well, I mean, I'll be completely honest about it. I've been very critical of Mike Woodson as a coach. I like Mike Woodson, but I think that the system he runs, I've been very critical of it. I'm very critical of his recruiting efforts, high school recruiting efforts. I think they've done really well in the portal over the last couple of years, or at least pretty darn good. And I've been really critical of roster building. I have to say, and I've been saying this on a Assembly call, I've been saying it publicly, they've nailed this offseason. I mean, they've absolutely crushed the portal. I mean, getting Umar Ballo, getting Cannon Carlisle, Miles Rice, Luke Goody, and Bryson Tucker. That's a phenomenal group to add. I have my skepticism on certain aspects of the program, and certainly still the system and how he's going to put the pieces together, and the fact that you're bringing in potentially 6 to 7 new players and trying to get them to play together very quickly without any chemistry and all of that stuff. Now, you can work that out, but I still want to see it before I feel like, oh, this team's going to compete for a national title or anything like that. But as far as putting the pieces together, also, let's be fair, bringing back Mackenzie Mbako, getting him to return, getting Trey Galloway to return, Anthony Leal for, leadership and things like that, keeping Malik Renew. They've done a phenomenal job. I don't know. I mean, a letter grade A- because there's still some holes on the back end. I think they do need some kind of backup rim protector. I know there's some guys out there that are looking at a backup. The front court is very thin. I'll say that. So, but as far as getting the talent in the spots they needed dynamic guards. They got Rice and Carlisle. Bryson Tucker, I see him more as a small forward, but he's a wing. They got a shooter in Luke Goody. They got a center to replace Khalil Ware, and they got the best one available. It looks like in Umar Ballo. I have no complaints on what they've done so far. I do think, again, they're not done yet. I think they need to find some juice for the bench in the front court. Other than that, though, I have no complaints about what they've done. I think that they have landed their top targets. I know a lot of money was put into it, and that was promised before the offseason even started, that we're going to get the guys this time and give Mike Woodson everything he needs to prove that he could be the coach at Indiana. So I can't, as skeptical as I've been, as critical as I've been of the program over the past couple of years, and this dates back to the Archie Miller era. It's not just Mike Woodson, but as critical as I've been, I can't say anything negative about what they've done this offseason. The only thing I say is I hope they find a way to fit these guys together, that they hit the ground running, as opposed to taking 2-3 months to get on their right foot, which they did last year. This needs to happen immediately. I have also said I think Mike Woodson's going to enter the season with the hottest seat in the country, and it's not necessarily internally, but nationally. It's a big brand, and it's a guy who has struggled and missed the tournament by a lot last year. You're entering the season with a lot of skepticism, and a lot of people are going to be talking about your job. So they have to hit for the health of the program. They have to hit the ground running.
Do you think it's just one backup big that they need to get at this point? Because I've been thinking about this a lot. You go through the roster right now, and I don't really, besides that spot, I don't know where there's minutes to get somebody else to commit. That you're to the point now where, sure, it'd be nice to go get another guard or somebody that can shoot, but how are you going to convince them that they're actually going to play any minutes? I don't. To me, it's like maybe you go into the season with 12, and maybe something else shakes free in the summer, or there's a midseason transfer. You have that spot. I know last year there was some criticism leaving a scholarship open, but this year I look at it and I'm like, I don't know how you're going to talk somebody else into taking that 13th spot.
Yeah, there aren't a whole lot of minutes left. I think that, and that's what I've been saying on Assembly Call. I've been saying, I hope try and get somebody with years left. So maybe they don't expect to play 20 minutes, 25 minutes right away, but it's somebody you can, hey, you're going to play some this year, and then you're going to take over for Umar Ballo next year. Like, I think that's what they have to target, are guys who can replace what's leaving. And I don't know who that is, though. I mean, I'll be honest, and I don't know what's out there, because most of the guys out there, it looks like, are pretty veteran. And so, but yeah, I think that they're probably just looking at a backup big. And again, you're right. If something shakes loose that you can't turn down, that's a whole other story. But right now, it looks like, they need a backup front court player. I mean, you could even, if you find a freshman who maybe is a project, you can maybe take 2 front court players, especially if let's say you get Hatton. He's gone after this year. So maybe you take a project behind him who's got some length, who can come in and steal some fouls or something. It really depends on what's available, but I don't see a whole lot of minutes either. I mean, Anthony Leal right now is probably last in the pecking order along with Ja'Kai Newton, and he can play. And so where do you fit all these guys? That's a problem for the coaching staff, but it's a good problem to have a lot of guys who can play. But it will be interesting to see how it shakes out, because Mike Woodson has tightened his rotation incredibly as seasons have gone along. I mean, if you're only playing, you've got a roster where 10 guys can play and have played, or we know they can play in the case of Bryson Tucker. What's that going to look like in February and March? Somebody's going to be upset with their lack of minutes.
Yeah, and I read some interesting comments. It was either yesterday or the day before John Calipari made about just roster building now in college basketball. And I always kind of take everything Calipari says with a grain of salt, because there's some motivation behind it. But he talked about only maybe having 8 or 9 players on his rosters moving forward, because in his eyes, it was, why take a project or somebody younger that you're going to have to develop over multiple years, because they could just leave. So why would I develop somebody for another program?
Yeah. You're paying to get them, and then you're paying to try and keep them. And also you could just pay to get that guy once he's developed.
Right. So that's kind of the one thing that gives me pause on getting like a developmental project, because let's say you bring in a guy and he plays very little, but you put all these resources into developing over a year, and then all of a sudden next year somebody calls him and says, hey, you only played 4 minutes a game in Indiana. Come here and we'll play you 25. And that's a real thing. So that's the one thing. It's kind of you're kind of between a rock and a hard place with taking a younger guy that may not play right away, because with the portal now, somebody gets in their ear and they're gone after 1 year. So
yeah, it's going to be interesting how this all shakes out. Sorry to cut you off, but it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out, because I think if you talk to coaches, you talk to administrators, and you talk to certain players, they don't love this system. Like nobody's really happy. The players are happy they're making money and they're happy they have freedom. But a lot of players commit to a place and then have a guy come in and take their minutes, and then they have to leave, and they don't want to leave, but they kind of have to. And so this free for all we're kind of in right now, I'm one of the people who is skeptical that it lasts forever or lasts more than another year or two, because the coaches are tired of it. They don't want this. And so I think eventually we're looking at some kind of multi-year contract situation that goes both ways, where the player is bound to the school and the school is bound to the player. They can't just process you out as soon as they get another transfer. I think that's where we're headed, because even guys who are super energetic and a little crazy like Danny Hurley are fed up with this. And a lot of the coaches who've been here a long time are just like, I can't do this anymore. So we'll see what happens with this whole situation, but I wouldn't bank on getting too comfortable with this system for too much longer.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the 45 days when the portal's open has to be as intense of a time for these coaches as any. I mean, obviously, I know there's a lot that goes into the season, preparing for games, scouting, working with your team. But in the case of Indiana, take Indiana this spring, they needed a ton of pieces from the portal, and also needed obviously to get Bryson Tucker or some kind of high school recruit that can make an impact for next season. It was all hands on deck within those walls.
It was like being in a tournament.
Right.
Honestly.
They were, and they're still working right now. I mean, even though the portal's closed, they still have 2 spots. And, I kind of went through, there's Big Ten programs that have 3 or 4 spots open. So it's not like those guys can now go on vacation. And I mean, and next weekend you've got the evaluation period, the one evaluation period for high school recruiting. So these guys have been at it since middle of September, I guess, late September with the start of practice. And then now they're going to go full steam into probably late May, early June, and may take a little bit of time off. And then the calendar is definitely longer. Now, I don't exactly feel sorry for them because they're making millions and millions of dollars a year, but I can understand from their standpoint where it's just completely different. Even from a coverage standpoint, I mean, I'm not complaining about it because it's been great for Inside the Hall. It's been great for Assembly Call and all these websites that have portal. It's extended the season. It's one thing I talked about a couple weeks ago with Mike DeCourcy. It's basically kept college basketball relevant for longer than it had been in the past. But it's a grind, and we're just a small part of it, talking and writing about it. But for the people that are actually trying to navigate the portal and land these players and set up visits, it's got to be a time-consuming beast.
Well, what's interesting is look at the great coaches who have retired or left in the past few years. I mean, Roy Williams and Coach K both felt like they'd coach forever until they would have to be stretchered off the court. Jay Wright just up and said no. And Jay Wright has had interest. He had an interest from Kentucky and Louisville and all these places. And he's just like, no, I have no interest in coming back.
Saban?
Nick Saban, a perfect example. Nick Saban's gone. And it's just, it's incredible. I know for a fact Pete Carroll had a chance to come back to college sports after he was let go by Seattle, and he just laughed. He was like, absolutely not. But then you look at the guys like Billy Donovan's in the NBA. He doesn't want to come back to college. Are you kidding me? The lifestyle, Brad Stevens had a chance to come back to college. He didn't want to come back to college because the lifestyle in the NBA is you play 82 games, which is a lot. But then your season's over, and it's over for a long time. You're in college. You're right now as a college coach, your season lasts about 350 days. And with recruiting, with evaluation, with film study, with all of that, plus the actual season, it's a full-time gig with no breaks. And it's, even in the dead periods, you know this, people are back channeling all the time during the season, quote unquote, not really tampering, but when the portal opens, I would say a third of the players know where they're going, or at least know it's down to 2 schools or something like that,
or at least know who really wants me, or who my people have already talked to, and this is my list.
This is my fit. This is my opening. I know that I got a spot here, spot here, spot here, spot here. Okay, here we go. And it's full time. It's all time. Why would you, if you're a coach who could do something else, like get paid millions of dollars to be an analyst, or you have enough money to retire, why would you deal with this? And that's what's happening. And I don't think it'll stop. I think there are certain people who can probably thrive in this environment. I think Hurley's one because of his energy, at least for now. I think Bill Self could thrive in this environment. There's a couple guys, Nate Oates probably has the energy right now to do it. But there's a lot of guys who are just going to finally be like, all right, is there an NBA spot open? I'll take it. Whereas college guys didn't jump to the NBA for a long time because they didn't like dealing with the personalities. Well, it's a very similar atmosphere now in both. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out as well with the coaches.
I think it's been about 2 months, a little over 2 months since Liam McNeely said that he was not coming to Indiana. Are you, how surprised are you at where things are now as compared to where they were a little over 2 months ago, and just in terms of the feeling of around the program and kind of the turn? I hesitate to say turnaround because no games have been played, and I think a lot of off seasons talking about these things, you can always kind of talk yourself into something, like the idea of like, oh well, last year it was CJ Gunn and Caleb Banks are going to develop, and Mackenzie Mbako is going to be one of the best freshmen, a one and done player, and Khalil Ware is going to be great, which he was, and Xavier Johnson's coming back as a, you could kind of piece it all together. This year feels a little different just based on kind of who they got, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but I'm just kind of curious, like how surprised you are at the turnaround and where we are in just a little over 2 months.
Incredibly surprised. I mean, I'll straight up admit it. I knew when they announced Mike Woodson was coming back, I knew that a lot of money was going to be put behind giving him a roster, and just from, we both talked to people in the program, around the program, that was part of that whole process was, okay, we're going to put a lot of money behind this roster. We're going to give him the roster that he feels he needs and let him prove it. And so I knew they would get guys, but I didn't know that they would be able, given how the program has performed under him, given how, guards have not played well under Mike Woodson, particularly well. Jalen Hood-Schifino was a lottery pick, and he played very well, but it took him a while to kind of fit in. But he hasn't featured guards to the degree that other programs do. So I was surprised that two really top portal guards came. I figured maybe you get one. I didn't think he'd get two. Getting Marballo, that makes sense to get a top big man. I didn't know you get the top big man. I thought he'd go somewhere like, a UConn or somewhere like that. So I'm really surprised at where it went. Bryson Tucker came out of nowhere. I mean, absolutely came out of nowhere. And it was very quick how that all came together. But, you went from having, it looked like 7 spots open, no high school recruits, and losing all these guys off of a team that completely flopped to now having what looks like a stacked roster. And there's no excuses anymore. I mean, this is, if you cannot win with this roster, if you can't compete for a Big Ten title, if you can't get out of the first weekend of the NCAA tournament with this roster, then you got to think about what you're doing. And God willing, I hope Mike Woodson's the guy to turn this around. I mean, I've said for years, I don't think they're doing a good job. I think the assistant coaches are doing as best they can, but I think he's having a hard time with these long-term relationship building recruitments. Now he's got a couple chances in 2025 to change that narrative, and I hope he does. But as an Indiana alum and a fan, I want Mike Woodson to be the guy to turn this around and to take Indiana to a championship. I don't want to do another coaching search. I'm sure you don't want to do another coaching search. It's a pain to do. It's not fun. And top coaches aren't switching jobs anymore. I mean, they really aren't. And so you're gambling whoever you get. But they've got to prove it this year. They really do, because they've got the players. There is no excuse now. Last year, like, well, the guard depth is thin. They don't have enough guards. This year, you don't have that excuse. And you didn't have shooters. Well, you got a couple guys who can shoot now. You've got to fit the roster, or fit the style to the roster, and make it work this year. So I'm very surprised at where they sit today. Now the next chapter is, you're not spiking the football yet. You got to figure out how to get these guys to play together, figure out how to win with them, and figure out how to sort of change the vibe of the program towards building into one of the top teams, top programs in the Big Ten, because you got the money of a top team in the Big Ten, but you can't pay for, you can't spend Kansas money and get Northwestern results. You've got to prove this.
I had a question in the mailbag that I did this week on Inside the Hall about expectations for next season and kind of what has to happen for Mike Woodson to kind of be the coach beyond next season. And I kind of said like the baseline to me is compete for the Big Ten title in the regular season. I didn't say win it because I think, there's an 18 team Big Ten now, and there's an unbalanced schedule, and a lot can happen. And that, I think if you're in the competition, if you're in the mix, one of the teams that's vying for a double bye in that range, I think you're pretty good in terms of where you are in the Big Ten. But beyond that, I said getting to the second weekend of the NCAA tournament, I think you should be able to do that at least once in 4 years. And if you can't do that, I think you have to have a conversation. In your eyes, kind of what are the baseline expectations that Indiana needs to meet next season as a team?
Same. Exact same. I think you have to compete for a Big Ten title. You have to be in the conversation. And whether that's how many games you finish out, it when you see it. Like, you're in contention. And it's interesting. In Trace Jackson Davis's last year, they finished 12-8 in the Big Ten. They were second technically in a big tie, but they finished 3 games behind Purdue. They weren't in contention. And the other thing is they finished 3 games behind Purdue despite beating Purdue twice, which means against everybody else, they were 5 games worse than Purdue. They were 10-8 in the Big Ten against everybody else. I don't consider that in contention. Yes, in the standings, they're right there, but there was a huge gap between them and the top team, despite, again, beating them twice. I think you have to be in contention. At the end of the season, you have to be, hey, things break our way, we can win this thing. I agree with you, though. Saying win it, we don't know what next season's going to look like with such a huge amount of change. But yes, in contention for the Big Ten. Feel like you're one of the best teams in the Big Ten all season long. When was the last time Indiana had that happen? And then you're absolutely right. Make the second week. You've got to get out of the first weekend of the NCAA tournament. The 2 times you've been in the tournament in the Mike Woodson era, you have gotten bounced emphatically from the tournament. You cannot have, in the first weekend, you cannot have that again. If you beat Miami in 2023, and you make the Sweet 16, even if you get crushed in the Sweet 16, you feel like, okay, we're building something here. But to get that protected seed, to win the first round game, and then to get run off the court. It was a great Miami team that made a run, but they were completely outclassed in that game. You cannot be outclassed in the first round of the tournament without any other success to lean on. If that happens to you once in a while, that's fine. But you have no other success in the tournament to lean on to say, like, well, yeah, but this year we did this. If that happens to you, you're not a top program. You have the money of the top program. You have the resources of the top program. And now you've got the players of a top program. You cannot perform like a mid-tier program in the tournament. And I think it was Bruce Pearl said, we play all these games all year and we're judged by 3 weekends. And it's how you do in the tournament is how you're judged. And whether that's fair or not, you guys signed up for the job. This is what your life is. You have to perform at that time of year. And there's no consolation prizes. Unless you win your conference regular season title, there's no consolation prizes.
Yeah, I do think there is something to how you lose in the tournament, because if, let's say, Indiana would have lost a very close game to St. Mary's that first year and gone to 2 overtimes against Miami and lost a heartbreaker, yes, and then Miami goes to the Final Four, I think you feel different about that. But when you're blown out 2 times like that, then I think that's when people are become more skeptical. Just kind of like going back to Crean when they lost to Syracuse. It wasn't like they just lost to Syracuse and Syracuse had this great game. They scored 50 points and they looked totally outclassed the whole game, like they weren't even in the game. And that was like a turning point for a lot of people to be like, well, from the coaching perspective, we had 2 top 4 picks in that game. We had Christian Watford. We had Jordan Holes, although he was injured. But what was missing? We didn't know how to beat this zone, right? And we looked completely outmanned from a coaching perspective. And the same thing kind of with Woodson with the St. Mary's game and the Miami game. The St. Mary's game, there's a little bit of an excuse based on the travel, but the Miami game, that was a complete no contest. And I think talent wise, they match up pretty well. Miami was the better team that night in all aspects of the game. So I think there's definitely something to the way you lose, and I hate to say like you have to make the second weekend, but I think that should be like a reasonable baseline expectation from that standpoint. Especially
at least once in 4 years when you're a program with the resources of Indiana, you have to. And I'll also say the thing you're saying about how you lose, people remember the end, whether it's a novel, whether it's a movie, whether it's a season. They remember the last thing that happens. I remember the year that it was Miller's. It was the year that COVID shut everything down. Indiana blew out Nebraska, and heading into that offseason, and it was a terrible Nebraska team with like football players deputized on the basketball team and all this. But they blew them out, and everybody went into that offseason like, all right, the team's coming together. And the next year was such a flop because the expectations were high because everybody remembered the last time they were on the court was the best they looked all year. It's the same with any kind of thing. If you lose in the national championship game by 50 in football, people will remember, well, were we really even in the national championship? Well, yeah, you got to the national championship game, but it doesn't matter. People remember how you finish, and losing to Miami the way they did, losing to St. Mary's the way they did, I mean, that was disappointing. I think that people felt after the St. Mary's loss, as you said, the excuses about the travel and all of that, felt like, there is some validity to that. They were exhausted after the run they made at the end of the season just to make it. But that Miami loss was like a bucket of cold water. And then to follow that up with this past season has really brought people's expectations down. And I think this portal class has raised them again. You can't have another flop like that. You just can't.
So you're our official IU West Coast correspondent. We've got these 4 Pac-12 teams now joining the Big Ten. What are USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington going to bring from a basketball perspective to the league? Obviously, Oregon was a good team last year. I'm not necessarily asking you to like break down the rosters or anything, but I'm just kind of curious how these teams fit into the culture of the Big Ten and what it's going to be like, if fans want to go see a game at one of these places. What is it going to feel like the Big Ten, or how long is it going to kind of take to get these programs kind of integrated into the culture of the Big Ten?
It's probably going to take some time. I think that, USC adding Musselman, they were an up and down team with Enfield, and I think they're going to continue to be a fast-paced up and down team with a lot of talent. I think Oregon's always going to have a lot of talent because thank you, Nike. UCLA, Mick Cronin, I mean, he feels like a Big Ten coach,
right?
But he's got a ton of talent that he can get up and down with, and I think last year was really a fluke for them being as down as they were. They've got a really nice roster returning, and he knew that. I think that from what I've heard, Mick was very excited to come back this year. He probably could have left. There were a couple jobs that were really interested in him, but he really believes in the roster that he has this year, and if he's ever going to leave, it's going to be after a good season, not a bad. I don't know if he's leaving. I'm not throwing that out there, but he really wanted to come back with this team that he's got coming back. And they had some guys, I think, between the year before and last year leave that they didn't expect to leave. They had some injuries, all of that. So they're going to be an interesting team to watch. Washington, I mean, you never know what they're going to be basketball-wise. They'll have stretches where they are phenomenal, and they'll have stretches where they're one of the worst teams in the country. So I don't even know what to expect from them. But you're going to get a lot of talent from these teams. Musselman, obviously a very good coach. Altman's a very solid coach. Cronin's a good coach. I mean, you're just elevating the coaching in the league, certainly. And then all of them, especially USC and Oregon, have a lot of money running through there. So they're going to be able to get players. UCLA's NIL department, not very good right now. They're looking to try and change that, but they don't have a ton of money. It's hurt them in football and it's hurt them in basketball. But I think that but USC and Oregon are going to have the money to compete with everybody. USC and Oregon are going to have that money. UCLA is trying to build that up, but all three can produce really good basketball teams and have over the past 5 to 10 years. So it's going to be interesting. It's not going to feel like the Big Ten. I mean, somebody said the other day, I said, "Oh, I'm going up to LA, whenever," and somebody said, "Oh, Big Ten country," and I was like, "God, it's so weird." Like,
yeah,
it's just.
Well, one thing I was just kind of curious about, like how it's always struck me. I haven't been to every road venue in the Big Ten. I've been to a lot of them, and I can like go into Mackey Arena, like, for an IU Purdue game. Obviously that's different because it's a rivalry game, but even going to Michigan State or Michigan or Ohio State, maybe Ohio State to a little lesser degree because their fans maybe aren't as engaged, but the atmosphere in those places, you're going to get something special. Are any of these schools a place where from an atmosphere or going to a game that these fan bases are truly behind basketball? Is it kind of something that to pass the time until another sport happens? I mean, how big are Because I've seen some UCLA games where it doesn't look like they're UCLA on TV. I'm just curious, like from maybe thinking from an IU perspective, when they go to these places to play on the road, is it going to be similar to going to a tough Big Ten venue, or is it maybe not going to be as challenging? Obviously, the travel means something, but I'm just kind of curious, like from your thoughts, like from an atmosphere perspective, is it going to stack up to other atmospheres in the Big Ten that we've seen?
Well, Washington, Oregon, and USC have great football atmospheres. For basketball, I mean, USC last year with Bronny James and Isaiah Collier and those guys had some really intense crowds and packed crowds, and there were a lot of celebrities and things like that. You'll definitely get that, but I don't think that it's not the same. It's definitely not the same right now. Maybe it develops into it. The Big Ten sort of bleeds into it, and it feels more competitive, and there's more money behind the program, so they can juice up their, getting students to the game programs and stuff like that. But I think from a football perspective, Autzen Stadium for Oregon is it's a madhouse. Washington is an incredible venue for football, and the atmosphere is fantastic, and there's a lot of tradition there. USC, you're playing in a stadium that's hosted 2 Olympics and is going to be a third pretty soon, and it's I think it's like 80,000 people, and so for those sports, for that sport, it is really intense. Basketball is a different vibe out here. It really is. UCLA is the one you would expect to have the Indiana tradition, and it really doesn't. And I don't know what the reason for that is, but it just isn't as much a part of life.
Is it maybe because there's so much else to do in LA that it's not?
That's some of it, certainly. I mean, LA, even the NFL teams are having trouble selling out, their gorgeous brand new stadium, because there are the things you could do. There's a ton of other places you can spend your entertainment dollar. There's a ton of other sports to compete with. And USC and UCLA basketball are pretty far down on the pecking order there. As for Washington, I just think they haven't been good consistently enough. Oregon gets a decent crowd. I think that, again, Eugene, not a whole lot else to do other than focus on sports, so they can be intense if they're good.
I think they're getting rid of their hideous court too.
Oh, thank God!
I think I read that.
That had to have been a requirement of the Big Ten for
entry. I was crossing my fingers, but I think I read that recently, so that'll be awesome.
Yeah, they don't need that. They already have the hideous uniforms. You don't need to add the court into it. But yeah, it's going to be a different vibe. It definitely is. The West Coast is different. I mean, you've had various teams. I think that if teams are good out here, people will support them rabidly. But if they're not, why am I going to waste my money and go do that? And look, you've seen at Indiana, the balcony's been empty for a long time. I mean, on and off. And so that's a generational thing. And it's also, when they're not great, why are people going to waste their time? They can watch it on TV if they really want to. So why have a bad seat in an arena when you can be at center court on TV at home? So I think that you're just seeing changes there. I think that smaller venues are probably in the future of college basketball, and probably college football eventually, for some of these programs. And the smaller, more intense atmosphere will probably be better because the money's coming from TV, and it will, that'll be the driver of revenue for the future, certainly.
The other thing that I've just started to think about more is just how much of an advantage the schools that are more, the centrally located school like Indiana is at an advantage over the West Coast schools, just in terms of the travel and schedule this year. Because I haven't heard the Big Ten come out and say this, or I haven't seen anything in terms of how the schedule is going to work. But I assume that if Indiana's going to play Oregon and Washington, which I believe that's their 2 road games in Big Ten this year on the West Coast, I assume they're going to probably try to go play those in one shot rather than having to go out there twice. Whereas on the schools that are on the West Coast, I mean, they may have to make 4 or 5 trips east to round out their schedule. So I think that's going to be something they're definitely going to have to navigate, because that's a big deal. I mean, the 3-hour time change for a lot of these schools. I mean, it's one thing if you're Purdue and you have to go west one time and do it, play a couple games. But if you're UCLA and you have to come east 3 or 4 or 5 times during the regular season and play a couple games, it's going to be a big deal for those schools.
That's why this never made sense from a West Coast school's perspective. Obviously, financially, it makes sense, but from a competition standpoint, it doesn't. I mean, your closest road game that's not on the West Coast is like 2,000 miles away.
But Nebraska, right?
Yeah, those flights are going to be brutal. I thought maybe the best way to do this, in my opinion, was for the Big Ten to also add Cal and Stanford, get the Bay Area market, and then split it up West Coast, East Coast, or West Coast, Midwest.
And then maybe play a couple games against the other.
And have like 1 or 2 crossover games, and then have it mostly be you silo off the 2 divisions, West and East, and then you have a championship game. And especially for football, that's what made the most sense for me. And even you could even call the Western half like the Pacific 10 or something like that, of the Big, and then the other just call it the classic Big 10 or something like that. Go to 20 and do that. They decided not to do that, and we'll see how this works for a couple years. But I think that might be in the cards eventually. I really do think that they're going to have to do something, because making these kids travel. I know they're getting paid now, but making them travel 3,000 miles several times a year is insane, as far as, if you want even the semblance of looking like they're going to school and they're doing things like that, it makes no sense to have them spend a week on the East Coast, for games and all that stuff.
I mean, I think it's tougher in basketball than football.
Oh,
because football is just one game. I mean, for football,
like where are you going to
you may play 4 or 5 road games in football, but basketball, you're playing 10 road games. So if you're UCLA, I mean, you're definitely going to get USC, you're going to get Oregon and Washington on the road, but then you got to find the other 7 somewhere else, and Nebraska's the closest one.
Yeah, you got to go to Rutgers and Maryland. I mean, and if let's say you go
Penn State,
you go to Rutgers and Maryland. Let's say they do those together, they match that as a weekend, and maybe it's like a Thursday, Sunday or something. What do you do for the other 2 days? I mean, you just go to town and stand around. I mean, do you have a venue you can go practice at? Like what? I mean, I'm sure they're going to have something for them,
right?
But like, how do you do that? And I know other conferences have done this for years, do like pair up, weekend trips. Like I know when USC, just from knowing people there, when they go to play the Arizona schools, they go and they just stay in Arizona and they do them over a weekend. But, it's different when you're going to Arizona from Los Angeles to going to New Jersey. I mean,
for sure.
So they're going to have to do something with this. And I think it'll take some years to figure it out.
I want to close with this, Ryan. Obviously, your new role at Sports Illustrated, the Olympics coming up this summer. Well, I mean, just from a sports perspective, like you're doing a little bit different work now in terms of what you're writing. What are you looking forward to the most in the upcoming months in terms of coverage and what you'll get to write about?
Well, I've always been a big swimming guy. I love the Olympic swimming. I'm addicted to it. Whether the U.S. is good or not, I'm going to be out of my mind for that. But also, honestly, I'm looking forward to watching Team USA basketball play. Like, my goodness, that roster. I've told people privately, I guess I'm saying it publicly now, I think they'd run circles around the dream team. That is one of the best rosters ever put together. It's insane. So I'm looking forward to seeing what those guys look like on the court. I mean, seeing Steph Curry and LeBron and in a non-All-Star game setting, seeing those guys competitively play together, Kevin Durant. I mean,
and now Anthony Edwards coming on like he is. What's that going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, come on. Like it's the best roster I think I've ever seen put together. And the fact that they were able to pull it off and get, like, Kawhi Leonard's never done it. And he's, I didn't even realize that. Anthony Davis is playing at some of his best in a long time, and he's in there. It's just absolutely loaded, and I don't even know how they're going to pick a starting 5, because all of them are all-stars. So that's going to be really fun to watch. Even though I would imagine, I don't want to jinx them, but they'll decimate the competition. It'll be really fun to watch those guys play together in a non-All-Star game setting, where they're not just throwing lobs; they're actually like competitively playing together with Steve Kerr running things. So that track and field, I think, is always a classic to watch. The sprinting, I think that's just incredibly exciting. So some of the basic sports I really do love to watch, but I'm a guy who I will throw on. I have 2 computers. I'll throw it on both of those. I'll throw it on the TV, and I'll watch the Olympic Channel. Americans have a finalist in trap shooting. Let's go watch that. And stuff that's would not be on my radar the other 3 3/4 of years, But I lock in. I do love the Olympics. I think it's one thing I do want to do, and they're coming to Los Angeles in 2028. My hope is to get to cover it. There's two things I've always wanted to cover. Has been the Olympics and the World Cup, just because I love when the whole world is together on something, and whether they come together, but also they're all focused on it. And I've always wanted to do both of those. And luckily, we're getting the World Cup in America in 2026 and Olympics in Los Angeles. I really wanted to go to Paris. I'm not going to get to go, but
you're the low man on the totem pole for that. You gotta do your time, right?
And I actually had something lined up for the big lead last year ish, and it never came together. But they had approved to let me go. I just had some things in the fire to line it up, and it didn't happen. So I'll sit on the sidelines this time. I'm ready to go in Los Angeles. So if I'm in San Diego, if they don't send me to Los Angeles, I'm gonna throw a fit. So, but 2028 it is for me.
Well, Ryan, it's always good to catch up with you. Thanks for carving out the time on this Friday afternoon in May. Always good to get your thoughts on IU basketball, and also good to catch up with you on the state of sports media. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Alex. It's always great to be here.
Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, preferably 5 stars. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.